Appendix. Introduction. Instead of attempting a formal reply in detail to a number of criticisms, I have thought it more likely to assist the reader if I offer first some brief explanations as to the main doctrines of my book, and then follow these by a more particular notice of certain difficulties. My selection of the points discussed is, I fear, to some extent arbitrary, but I will ask my critics not to assume, where they fail to find a recognition of their objections, that I have treated these with disrespect. 1. With regard to the arrangement of my work, I offer no defense. It was not in my power to write a systematic treatise, and, that being so, I thought the way I took was as good as any other. The order of the book seemed to myself a matter of no great importance. So far as I can see, whatever way I had taken, the result would have been the same, and I must doubt if any other way would have been better for most readers. From whatever point we had begun, we should have found ourselves entangled in the same puzzles, and have been led to attempt the same way of escape. The arrangement of the book does not correspond to the order of my thoughts, and the same would have been true of any other arrangement which it was in my power to adopt. I might very well, for instance, have started with the self as a given unity, and have asked how far any other things are real otherwise, and how far again the self satisfies its own demands on reality. Or I might have begun with the fact of knowledge and have inquired what in the end that involves, or I could once more readily have taken my departure from the ground of volition or desire. None of these ways would to myself have been really inconvenient, and they would all have led to the same end. But to satisfy at once the individual preference of each reader was not possible, nor am I sure that in the end the reader really is helped by starting on the road which he prefers. The want of system in my book is, however, another matter, and this I admit and regret. 2. The actual starting point and basis of this work is an assumption about truth and reality. I have assumed that the object of metaphysics is to find a general view which will satisfy the intellect, and I have assumed that whatever succeeds in doing this is real and true, and that whatever fails is neither. This is a doctrine which, so far as I see, can neither be proved nor questioned. The proof or the question, it seems to me, must imply the truth of the doctrine, and, if that is not assumed, both vanish. And I see no advantage in dwelling further on this point. But with this we come against the great problem of the relation of thought to reality. For if we decline, as I think wrongly, to affirm that all truth is thought, yet we certainly cannot deny this of a great deal of truth, and we can hardly deny that truth satisfies the intellect. But, if so, truth therefore, as we have seen, is real. And to hold that truth is real, not because it is true but because also it is something else, seems untenable, for, if so, the something else left outside would make incomplete and would hence falsify the truth. But then, on the other hand, can thought, however complete, be the same as reality, the same altogether, I mean, and with no difference between them? This is a question to which I could never give an affirmative reply. It is useless here to seek to prove that the real involves thought as its sine qua non, for that much, when proved, does not carry the conclusion. And it is useless again to urge that thought is so inseparable from every mode of experience that in the end it may be said to cover all the ground. That is, it seems to me, once more merely the inconclusive argument from the sine qua non, or else the conclusion is vitiated from another side by the undue extension of thought's meaning. Thought has now been taken, that is, to include so much more than truth in the narrow sense, that the old question as to how truth in this sense stands to reality must break out more or less within thought itself. Nor again does it seem clear why we must term this whole thought and not feeling, or will, unless we can show that these really are modes of thought, while thought cannot fall under them. For otherwise our conclusion seems but verbal and arbitrary, and again an argument drawn from the mere hegemony of thought could not prove the required conclusion. But with this we are left, it appears, in a dilemma. There is a difference between on the one side truth or thought. It will be convenient now to identify these, and on the other side reality. But to assert this difference seems impossible without somehow transcending thought or bringing the difference into thought, and these phrases seem meaningless. Thus reality appears to be another different from truth, and yet not able to be truly taken as different, and this dilemma to myself was long a main cause of perplexity and doubt. We indeed do something to solve it by the identification of being or reality with experience or with sentience in its widest meaning. This step I have taken without hesitation, and I will not add a further defense of it here. The most serious objection to it is raised, I think, from the side of solipsism, and I have treated that at length. But this step by itself leaves us far from the desired solution of our dilemma, for between facts of experience and the thought of them and the truth about them the difference still remains, and the difficulty which attaches to this difference. The solution of this dilemma offered in Chapter 15 is, I believe, the only solution possible. It contains the main thesis of this work, views opposed to that thesis remaining, it seems to me, caught in and destroyed by the dilemma. And we must notice two main features in this doctrine. It contends on one side that truth or thought essentially does not satisfy its own claims, that it demands to be, and so far already is, something which completely it cannot be. Hence if thought carried out its own nature, it both would and would not have passed beyond itself and become also another. And in the second place this self-completion of thought, by inclusion of the aspects opposed to mere thinking, would be what we mean by reality, and by reality we can mean no more than this. The criticisms on this doctrine which I have seen do not appear to me to rest on any serious inquiry either as to what the demands of thought really are, or what their satisfaction involves. But if to satisfy the intellect is to be true and real, such a question must be fundamental. For, with the solution of this problem about truth comes the whole view of reality. Reality is above thought and above every partial aspect of being, but it includes them all. Each of these completes itself by uniting with the rest, and so makes the perfection of the whole. And this whole is experience, for anything other than experience is meaningless. Now anything that in any sense is, qualifies the absolute reality, and so is real. But on the other hand, because everything, to complete itself and to satisfy its own claims, must pass beyond itself, nothing in the end is real except the absolute. Everything else is appearance. It is that the character of which goes beyond its own existence is inconsistent with it and transcends it. And viewed intellectually, appearance is error. But the remedy lies in supplementation by inclusion of that which is both outside and yet essential, and in the absolute this remedy is perfected. There is no mere appearance or utter chance or absolute error, but all is relative. And the degree of reality is measured by the amount of supplementation required in each case, and by the extent to which the completion of anything entails its own destruction as such. L5. But this absolute, it has been objected, is a mere blank or else unintelligible. Certainly, it is unintelligible if that means that you cannot understand its detail, and that throughout its structure constantly and particularly you are unable to answer the question, why or how. And that it is not in this sense intelligible I have clearly laid down. But as to its main character we must return a different reply. We start from the diversity and unity which is given in feeling, and we develop this internally by the principle of self-completion beyond self, until we reach the idea of an all-inclusive and superrelational experience. This idea, it seems to me, is in the abstract intelligible and positive, and so once more is the principle by which it is reached, and the criticism which takes these as mere negations rests, I think, on misunderstanding. The criticism which really desires to be effective ought, I should say, to show that my view of the starting point is untenable, and the principle of development, together with its result, unsound, and such criticism I have not yet seen. But with regard to what is unintelligible and inexplicable we must surely distinguish. A theory may contain what is unintelligible, so long as it really contains it, and not to know how a thing can be is no disproof of our knowing that it both must be and is. The whole question is whether we have a general principle under which the details can and must fall, or whether, on the other hand, the details fall outside or are negative instances which serve to upset the principle. Now I have argued in detail that there are no facts which fall outside the principle or really are negative instances. And hence, because the principle is undeniable, the facts both must and can comply with it, and therefore they do so. And given a knowledge of how, in general, a mere ignorance of how in detail is permissible and harmless. Point 1. This argument in its general character is, I presume, quite familiar even to those critics who seem to have been surprised by it. And the application of it here is, so far as I see, legitimate and necessary. And for that application I must refer to the body of the work. 6. With regard to the unity of the absolute, we know that the absolute must be one, because anything experienced is experienced in or as a whole, and because anything like independent plurality or external relations cannot satisfy the intellect. And it fails to satisfy the intellect because it is a self-contradiction. Again, for the same reason, the absolute is one system in the very highest sense of that term, any lower sense being unreal because in the end self-contradictory. The subjects of contradiction and of external relations are further dealt with in a later part of this appendix, notes A and B. 7. I will go on to notice an objection which has been made by several critics. It is expressed in the following extract from the Philosophical Review, Volume 4. Page 235. All phenomena are regarded as infected with the same contradiction, and that they all involve a union of the one and the many. It is therefore impossible to apply the notion of degrees of truth and reality. If all appearances are equally contradictory, all are equally incapable of aiding us to get nearer to the ultimate nature of reality. And it is added that on this point there seems to be a consensus of opinion among my critics. Now I think I must have failed to understand the exact nature of this point, since, as I understand it, it offers no serious difficulty. In fact, this matter, I may say, is for good or for evil so old and so familiar to my mind that it did not occur to me as a difficulty at all, and so was not noticed. But suppose that in theology I say that all men before God, and measured by him, are equally sinful, does that preclude me from also holding that one is worse or better than another? And if I accept the fact of degrees in virtue, may I not believe also that virtue is one and is perfection, and that you must attain to it or not? And is all this really such a hopeless puzzle? Suppose that for a certain purpose I want a stick exactly 1 yard long. Am I wrong when I condemn both 1 inch and 35 inches, and any possible sum of inches up to 36, as equally and alike coming short? Surely if you view perfection and completeness in one way, it is a case of either yes or no. You have either reached it or not, and there either is defect or there is none. But in the imperfect, viewed otherwise, there is already more or less of a quality or character, the selfsame character which, if all defect were removed, would attain to and itself would be perfection. Wherever there is a scale of degrees, you may treat the steps of this as being more or less perfect, or again you may say, no, they are none of them perfect, and so regarded they are equal, and there is no difference between them. That indeed is what must happen when you ask of each whether it is perfect or not. This question of yes or no I asked about appearances in connection with reality, and I have in my book used language which certainly contradicts itself, unless the reader perceives that there is more than one point of view. And I assumed that the reader would perceive this, and I cannot doubt that very often he has done so, and I think that even always he might have done so, if he would but carry into metaphysics all the ideas with which he is acquainted outside, and not an arbitrary selection from them. And among the ideas to be thus treated not as true but as at least existing, I would instance specially some leading ideas of the Christian religion as to freedom, the worth of mere morality, and the independent self-sufficiency of finite persons and things. For myself, though I have not hesitated to point out the falsity and immorality of some Christian doctrines, where this seemed necessary, I cannot approve of the widespread practice of treating them as devoid even of existence. But if, after all, my critics had in view not the above but something else, and if the objection means that I do not explain why and how there is any diversity and anything like degree at all, I am at no loss for a reply. I answer that I make no pretense to do this. But on the other side I have urged again and again that a general conclusion is not upset by a failure to explain in detail, unless that detail can be shown to be a negative instance. If finally the use of the phrase mere appearance has caused difficulty, that has been, I think, already explained above. This phrase gets its meaning by contrast with the absolute. When you ask about any appearance unconditionally whether it is reality or not, yes or no, you are forced to reply no, and you may express that unconditional no by using the word one mere. At least one of my critics would, I think, have done well if, before instructing me as to the impossibility of any mere appearance, he had consulted my index under the head of error. I must end by saying that, on this question of degrees of appearance and reality, I have found but little to which my critics can fairly object, unless their position is this: that of two proper and indispensable points of view I have unduly emphasized one. Whether I have done this or not I will not attempt to decide, but, if this is what my critics have meant, I cannot felicitate them on their method of saying it. But I would once more express my regret that I was not able to deal systematically with the various forms of appearance. If I had done this, it would have become clear that, and how, each form is true as well as untrue, and that there is an evolution of truth. We should have seen that each really is based on, and is an attempt to realize the same principle, a principle which is not wholly satisfied by any, and which condemns each because each is an inadequate appearance of itself. 8. I must now touch briefly on a point of greater difficulty. Why, it has been asked, have I not identified the Absolute with the Self? Now, as I have already remarked, my whole view may be taken as based on the Self, nor again could I doubt that a self, or a system of selves, is the highest thing that we have. But when it is proposed to term the Absolute Self, I am compelled to pause. In order to reach the idea of the Absolute, our finite selves must suffer so much addition and so much subtraction that it becomes a grave question whether the result can be covered by the name of self. When you carry out the idea of a self or of a system of selves beyond a certain point, when, that is to say, you have excluded, as such, all finitude and change and chance and mutability, have you not in fact carried your idea really beyond its proper application? I am forced to think that this is so, and I also know no reason why it should not be so. The claim of the individual, as such, to perfection I wholly reject. And the argument that, if you scruple to say self, you are therefore condemned to accept something lower, seems to me thoroughly unsound. I have contended that starting from the self one can advance to a positive result beyond it, and my contention surely is not met by such a bare unreasoned assumption of its falsity. And if finally I hear, well, you yourself admit that the Absolute is unintelligible, why then object to saying that the Absolute somehow unintelligibly is self and the self is somehow unintelligibly absolute? That gives me no trouble. For the Absolute, though in detail unintelligible, is not so in general, and its general character comes as a consequence from a necessary principle. And against this consequence we have to set nothing but privation and ignorance. But to make the self, as such, absolute is, so far as I see, to postulate in the teeth of facts, facts which go to show that the self's character is gone when it ceases to be relative. And this postulate itself, I must insist, is no principle at all, but is a mere prejudice and misunderstanding. And the claim of this postulate, if made, should in my opinion be made openly and explicitly. But as to the use of the word self, so long only as we know what we mean and do not mean by it, I am far from being irreconcilable. I am of course opposed to any attempt to set up the finite self as in any sense ultimately real, or again as real at all outside of the temporal series. And I am opposed once more to any kind of attempt to make the distinction between experience and the experienced more than relative. But on these and on other points I do not think that it would prove useful to enlarge further. 9. I will now briefly touch on my attitude toward skepticism. Most persons, I think, who have read my book intelligently, will credit me with a desire to do justice to skepticism, and indeed I might claim, perhaps, myself to be something of a skeptic. But with all my desire I, of course, may very well have failed, and it would be to me most instructive if I could see an examination of my last chapter by some educated and intelligent skeptic. Up to the present, however, nothing of the kind has been brought to my notice. And perhaps the skeptical temper does not among us often go with addiction to metaphysics. And I venture to think this a misfortune. Intellectual skepticism certainly is not one thing with a skeptical temper, and it is the result only of labor and education. That, it seems, is not the opinion of the writer in mind, who has come forward as the true representative of the skeptics. He will, perhaps, not be surprised when I question his right to that position, and when I express my conviction of his ignorance as to what true skepticism is. His view of skepticism is, in brief, that it consists in asking, "But what do you mean?" The idea apparently has not occurred to him that to question or doubt intelligently you must first understand. If I, for instance, who know no mathematics, were to reiterate about some treatise on the calculus, "But what does it mean?" I should hardly in this way have become a skeptic mathematically. Skepticism of this kind is but a malady of childhood, and is known as one symptom of imbecility, and it surely has no claim to appear as a philosophical attitude. If about any theory you desire to ask intelligently the question, "What does it mean?" you must be prepared, I should have thought, to enter into that theory. And attempting to enter into it you are very liable, in raising your doubts, to base yourself tacitly on some dogma which the theory in question has given its reason for rejecting. And to avoid such crude dogmatism is not given to every man who likes to call himself a skeptic. And it is given to no man, I would repeat, without labor and education. But in the article which I have cited there is, apart from this absurd idea about skepticism, nothing we need notice. There are some mistakes and failures to comprehend of an ordinary type, coupled with some mere dogmatism of an uninteresting kind. And it is to myself a matter of regret that generally in this point I have been helped so little by my critics, and am compelled still to do most of my skepticism for myself. 10. The doctrine of this work has been condemned as failing to satisfy the claims of our nature, and has been charged with being after all no better than agnosticism. Now, without discussing the meaning of this term, a subject in which I am not much at home, I should like to insist on what to me seems capital. According to the doctrine of this work, that which is highest to us is also in and to the universe most real, and there can be no question of its reality being somehow upset. In commonplace materialism, on the other hand, that which in the end is real is certainly not what we think highest, this latter being a secondary and, for all we know, a precarious result of the former. And again, if we embrace mere ignorance, we are in the position that, for anything we know, our highest beliefs are illusions, or at any moment may become so, and at any moment may be brought to naught by something, we do not know what. And I submit that the difference between such doctrines and those of this work is really considerable. And if I am told that generally the doctrines of this book fail to satisfy our nature's demands, I would request first a plain answer to a question which, I think, is plain. Am I to understand that somehow we are to have all that we want and have it just as we want it? For myself, I should reply that such a satisfaction seems to me impossible. But I do not feel called on to criticize this demand until I see it stated explicitly, and at present I merely press for a plain answer to my question. And if the real question is not this, and if it concerns only the satisfaction somehow of our nature's main claims, I do not see that, as compared with other views about the world, the view of this work is inferior. I am supposing it to be compared, of course, only with views that aim at theoretical consistency, and not with mere practical beliefs. Practical beliefs, we know, are regulated by working efficiency. They emphasize one point here, and they suppress another point there, without much care to avoid a theoretical self-contradiction. And working beliefs of any kind, I imagine, can more or less exist under and together with any kind of theoretical doctrine. The comparison I have in view here is of another order, and would be made between doctrines each of which claim to be a true and consistent account of the whole of things. Such a comparison I do not propose to make, since it would require much space, and, while perhaps serving little purpose otherwise, could not fail to give great offense. But there are two conditions of any fair comparison on which I would insist in a question about the satisfaction of our nature. All the aspects of that nature must first be set forth, and not a one-sided distortion of these, or an arbitrary selection from them. And in the second place, every side of the doctrines compared must be stated without suppression of any features that may be found inconvenient, for every view of the world, we must all agree, has its own special difficulties. Where, for instance, from a theistic or a Christian point of view a writer condemns, say, a naturalistic account of good and evil, would that writer, if he had a desire for fairness and truth, fail to recall the fact that his own view also has been morally condemned? Would he forget that the relation of an omniscient moral creator to the things of his hand has given trouble intellectually, and is morally perhaps not from all sides comfortable? His attitude, I judge, would be otherwise, and this judgment, I submit, is that of every fair-minded man, whatever doctrines otherwise he may hold. Nothing is easier than to make a general attack on any doctrine while the alternative is ignored, and few things, I would add, are, at least in philosophy, less profitable. With this I will pass to a special treatment of some difficult problems. Note A. Contradiction, and the contrary. If we are asked what is contrary or contradictory, I do not find it necessary here to distinguish between these. The more we consider, the more difficult we find it to answer. A thing cannot be or do two opposites at once and in the same respect. This reply at first sight may seem clear, but on reflection may threaten us with an unmeaning circle. For what are opposites except the adjectives which the thing cannot so combine? Hence we have said no more than that we in fact find predicates which in fact will not go together, and our further introduction of their opposite natures seems to add nothing. Opposites will not unite, and their apparent union is mere appearance. But the mere appearance really perhaps only lies in their intrinsic opposition. And if one arrangement has made them opposite, a wider arrangement may perhaps unmake their opposition, and may include them all at once and harmoniously. Are, in short, opposites really opposite at all, or are they, after all, merely different? Let us attempt to take them in this latter character. A thing cannot without an internal distinction be, or do, two different things, and differences cannot belong to the same thing in the same point unless in that point there is diversity. The appearance of such a union may be fact, but is for thought a contradiction. This is the thesis which to me seems to contain the truth about the contrary, and I will now try to recommend this thesis to the reader. The thesis in the first place does not imply that the end which we seek is tautology. Thought most certainly does not demand mere sameness, which to it would be nothing. A bare tautology is not even so much as a poor truth or a thin truth. It is not a truth in any way, in any sense, or at all. Thought involves analysis and synthesis, and if the law of contradiction forbade diversity, it would forbid thinking altogether. And with this too necessary warning, I will turn to the other side of the difficulty. Thought cannot do without differences, but on the other hand it cannot make them. And, as it cannot make them, so it cannot receive them merely from the outside and ready-made. Thought demands to go proprio motu, or, what is the same thing, with a ground and reason. Now to pass from A to B, if the ground remains external, is for thought to pass with no ground at all. But if, again, the external fact of A's and 7's conjunction is offered as a reason, then that conjunction itself creates the same difficulty. For thought's analysis can respect nothing, nor is there any principle by which at a certain point it should arrest itself or be arrested. Every distinguishable aspect becomes therefore for thought a diverse element to be brought to unity. Hence thought can no more pass without a reason from A or from B to its conjunction than before it could pass groundlessly from A to B. The transition, being offered as a mere datum or effected as a mere fact, is not thought's own self-movement, or in other words, because for thought no ground can be merely external, the passage is groundless. Thus A and B and their conjunction are, like atoms, pushed in from the outside by chance or fate, and what is thought to do with them but either make or accept an arrangement which to it is wanton and without reason, or, having no reason for anything else, attempt against reason to identify them simply? This is not so, I shall be told, and the whole case is otherwise. There are certain ultimate complexes given to us as facts, and these ultimates, as they are given, thought simply takes up as principles and employs them to explain the detail of the world. And with this process thought is satisfied. To me such a doctrine is quite erroneous. For these ultimates cannot make the world intelligible, and again B they are not given, and C in themselves they are self-contradictory, and not truth but appearance. Certainly for practice we have to work with appearance and with relative untruths, and without these things the sciences of course would not exist. There is, I suppose, here no question about all this, and all this is irrelevant. The question here is whether with so much as this the intellect can be satisfied, or whether on the other hand it does not find in the end defect and self-contradiction. Consider first the failure of what is called explanation. The principles taken up are not merely in themselves not rational, but, being limited, they remain external to the facts to be explained. The diversities therefore will only fall, or rather must be brought, under the principle. They do not come out of it, nor of themselves do they bring themselves under it. The explanation therefore in the end does but conjoin aliens inexplicably. The obvious instance is the mechanical interpretation of the world. Even if here the principles were rational intrinsically, as surely they are not, they express but one portion of a complex whole. The rest therefore, even when and where it has been brought under the principles, is but conjoined with them externally and for no known reason. Hence in the explanation there is in the end neither self-evidence nor any because except that brutally things come so. But in any case, I may hear, these complexes are given and do not contradict themselves, and let us take these points in their order. B. The transition from A to B, the inherence of B and C as adjectives in A, the union of discretion and continuity in time and space, such things are facts, it is said. They are given to an intellect which is satisfied to accept and to employ them. They may be facts, I reply, in some sense of that word, but to say that, as such and in and by themselves, they are given is erroneous. What is given is a presented whole, a sensuous total in which these characters are found, and beyond and beside these characters there is always given something else. And to urge, but at any rate these characters are there, is surely futile. For certainly they are not, when there, as they are when you by an abstraction have taken them out. Your contention is that certain ultimate conjunctions of elements are given. And I reply that no such bare conjunction is or possibly can be given. For the background is present, and the background and the conjunction are, I submit, alike integral aspects of the fact. The background therefore must be taken as a condition of the conjunction's existence, and the intellect must assert the conjunction subject in this way to a condition. The conjunction is hence not bare but dependent, and it is really a connection mediated by something falling outside it. A thing, for example, with its adjectives can never be simply given. It is given integrally with a mass of other features, and when it is affirmed of reality, it is affirmed of reality qualified by this presented background. And this reality is, and must be qualified also by what transcends any one presentation. Hence the mere complex, alleged to be given to the intellect, is really a selection made by or accepted by that intellect. An abstraction cuts away a mass of environing particulars and offers the residue bare, as something given and to be accepted free from supporting conditions. And for working purposes such an artifice is natural and necessary, but to offer it as ultimate fact seems to me to be monstrous. We have an intellectual product, to be logically justified, if indeed that could be possible, and most certainly we have not a genuine datum. At this point we may lay down an important result. The intellect cannot be reduced to choose between accepting an irrational conjunction or rejecting something given. For the intellect can always accept the conjunction not as bare but as a connection, the bond of which is at present unknown. It is taken therefore as by its self-appearance, which is less or more false in proportion as the unknown conditions, if filled in, less or more would swamp and transform it. The intellect therefore, while rejecting whatever is alien to itself, if offered as absolute, can accept the inconsistent if taken as subject to conditions. Beside absolute truth there is relative truth, useful opinion, and validity, and to this latter world belong so-called non-rational facts. And any mere conjunction, I go on to urge, is for thought self-contradictory. Thought, I may perhaps assume, implies analysis and synthesis and distinction in unity. Further, the mere conjunction offered to thought cannot be set apart itself as something sacred, but may itself properly and indeed must become thought's object. There will be a passage therefore from one element in this conjunction to its other element or elements. And on the other hand, by its own nature, thought must hold these in unity. But, in a bare conjunction, starting with a thought will externally be driven to be, and seeking to unite these it will find no ground of union. Thought can of itself supply no internal bond by which to hold them together, nor has it any internal diversity by which to maintain them apart. It must therefore seek barely to identify them, though they are different, or somehow to unite both diversities where it has no ground of distinction and union. And this does not mean that the connection is merely unknown and may be affirmed as unknown, and also, supposing it were known, as rational. For, if so, the conjunction would at once not be bare, and it is as bare that it is offered and not as conditional. But, if on the other hand it remains bare, then thought to affirm it must unite diversities without any internal distinction, and the attempt to do this is precisely what contradiction means. But, I shall be told, you misrepresent the case. What is offered is not the elements apart, nor the elements plus an external bond, but the elements together and in conjunction. Yes, I reply, but the question is how thought can think what is offered. If thought in its own nature possessed a together, a between, and an all at once, then in its own intrinsic passage, or at least somehow in its own way and manner, it could reaffirm the external conjunction. But if these sensible bonds of union fall outside the inner nature of thought, just as much as do the sensible terms which they outwardly conjoin, the case surely is different. Then forced to distinguish and unable to conjoin by its own proper nature, or with a reason, thought is confronted by elements that strive to come together without a way of union. The sensible conjunctions remain for thought mere other elements in the congeries, themselves failing in connection and external to others. And, on the other hand, driven to unite without internal distinction, thought finds in this attempt a self-contradiction. You may exclaim against thought's failure, and in this to some degree I am with you, but the fact remains thus. Thought cannot accept tautology and yet demands unity in diversity. But your offered conjunctions on the other side are for it no connections or ways of union. They are themselves merely other external things to be connected. And so thought, knowing what it wants, refuses to accept something different, something which for it is appearance, a self-inconsistent attempt at reality and truth. It is idle from the outside to say to thought, well, unite but do not identify. How can thought unite except so far as in itself it has a mode of union? To unite without an internal ground of connection and distinction is to strive to bring together barely in the same point, and that is self-contradiction. Things are not contrary because they are opposite, for things by themselves are not opposite. And things are not contrary because they are diverse, for the world as a fact holds diversity in unity. Things are self-contrary when, and just so far as, they appear as bare conjunctions, when in order to think them you would have to predicate differences without an internal ground of connection and distinction, when, in other words, you would have to unite diversity simply, and that means in the same point. This is what contradiction means, or I at least have been able to find no other meaning. For a mere together, a bare conjunction in space or time, is for thought unsatisfactory and in the end impossible. It depends for its existence on our neglecting to reflect, or on our purposely abstaining, so far as it is concerned, from analysis and thought. But any such working arrangement, however valid, is but provisional. On the other hand, we have found that no intrinsical opposites exist, but that contraries, in a sense, are made. Hence in the end nothing is contrary nor is there any insoluble contradiction. Contradictions exist so far only as internal distinction seems impossible, only so far as diversities are attached to one unyielding point assumed, tacitly or expressly, to be incapable of internal diversity or external complement, but any such fixture is an abstraction, useful perhaps, but in the end appearance. And thus, where we find contradiction, there is something limited and untrue which invites us to transcend its standing. Contradictions appear where the subject is narrowed artificially, and where diversity in the identity is taken as excluded. A thing cannot be at once in two places if in the at once there is no lapse, nor can one place have two bodies at once if both claim it in their character as extended. The soul cannot affirm and deny at a single time, unless the self itself may be divided. And, to speak in general, the more narrowly we take the subject, and the less internal ground for diversity it contains, the more it threatens us with standing or insoluble contradictions. But, we may add, so much the more abstractedness and less truth does such a subject possess. We may instance the presence of disparate qualities, such as white, hard, and hot, in a single thing. The thing is presented as one feature of an indefinite complex, and it is affirmed as predicate of a reality transcending what is given. It is hence capable in all ways of indefinite addition to its apparent character. And to deny that in the real thing can be an internal diversity and ground of distinction seems quite irrational. But so far as for convenience or from thoughtlessness the denial is made, and the real thing is identified with our mutilated and abstract view of the thing, so far the disparate qualities logically clash and become contradictory. The law of contradiction tells us that we must not simply identify the diverse, since their union involves a ground of distinction. So far as this ground is rightly or wrongly excluded, the law forbids us to predicate diversities. Where the ground is merely not explicit or remains unknown, our assertion of any complex is provisional and contingent. It may be valid and good, but it is an incomplete appearance of the real, and its truth is relative. Yet, while it offers itself as but contingent truth and as more or less incomplete appearance, the law of contradiction has nothing against it but abstracted and irrational conjunctions taken by themselves as reality and truth. In short, facts as they are accepted by too many philosophers, the I all must condemn. And about the truth of this law, so far as it applies, there is in my opinion no question. The question will be rather as to how far the law applies, and how far therefore it is true. But before we conclude, there is a matter we may do well to consider. In this attempt to attribute diversity and to avoid appendix contradiction, what in the end would satisfy the intellect supposing that it could be got? This question, I venture to think, is too often ignored. Too often a writer will criticize and condemn some view as being that which the mind cannot accept, when he apparently has never asked himself what it is that would satisfy the intellect, or even whether the intellect could endure his own implied alternative. What in the end, then, let us ask, would content the intellect? While the diversities are external to each other and to their union, ultimate satisfaction is impossible. There must, as we have seen, be an identity, and in that identity a ground of distinction and connection. But that ground, if external to the elements into which the conjunction must be analyzed, becomes for the intellect a fresh element, and it itself calls for synthesis and a fresh point of unity. But herein, because in the intellect no intrinsic connections were found, ensues the infinite process. Is there a remedy for this evil? The remedy might lie here. If the diversities were complementary aspects of a process of connection and distinction, the process not being external to the elements or again a foreign compulsion of the intellect, but itself the intellect's own proprius motus, the case would be altered. Each aspect would of itself be a transition to the other aspect, a transition intrinsic and natural at once to itself and to the intellect. And the whole would be a self-evident analysis and synthesis of the intellect itself by itself. Synthesis here has ceased to be mere synthesis and has become self-completion, and analysis, no longer mere analysis, is self-explication. And the question how or why the many are one and the one is many here loses its meaning. There is no why or how beside the self-evident process, and towards its own differences this whole is at once their how and their why, their being, substance and system, their reason, ground, and principle of diversity and unity. Has the law of contradiction anything here to condemn? It seems to me it has nothing. The identity of which diversities are predicated is in no case simple. There is no point which is not itself internally the transition to its complement, and there is no unity which fails in internal diversity and ground of distinction. In short, the identity of opposites, far from conflicting with the law of contradiction, may claim to be the one view which satisfies its demands, the only theory which everywhere refuses to accept a standing contradiction. One, and if all that we find were in the end such a self-evident and self-complete whole, containing in itself as constituent processes the detail of the universe, so far as I see the intellect would receive satisfaction in full. But for myself, unable to verify a solution of this kind, connections in the end must remain in part mere syntheses, the putting together of differences external to one another and to that which couples them. And against my intellectual world the law of contradiction has therefore claims nowhere satisfied in full. And since, on the other hand, the intellect insists that these demands must be and are met, I am led to hold that they are met in and by a whole beyond the mere intellect. And in the intellect itself I seem to find an inner want and defect and a demand thus to pass itself beyond itself. And against this conclusion I have not yet seen any tenable objection. The view which to me appears to be true is briefly this: that abstract identity should satisfy the intellect, even in part, is wholly impossible. On the other hand, I cannot say that to me any principle or principles of diversity and unity are self-evident. The existence of a single content, I will not call it a quality, which should be simple experience and being in one, is to me not in itself impossible intrinsically. If I may speak mythologically, I am not sure that, if no diversity were given, the intellect of itself could invent it or would even demand it. But, since diversity is there as a fact, any such hypothesis seems illegitimate. As a fact and given we have in feeling diversity and unity in one whole, a whole implicit and not yet broken up into terrace and relations. This immediate union of the one and many is an ultimate fact from which we start, and to hold that feeling, because immediate, must be simple and without diversity is, in my view, a doctrine quite untenable. That I myself should have been taken as committed to this doctrine is to me, I must be allowed to add, really surprising. But feeling, if an ultimate fact, is not true ultimately or real. Even of itself it is self-transcendent and transitory. And, when we try to think its unity, then, as we have seen, we end in failure. For thought in its own nature has no together and is forced to move by way of terms and relations, and the unity of these remains in the end external and, because external, inconsistent. But the conclusion I would recommend is no vain attempt either to accept bare identity or to relapse into a stage before thinking begins. Self-existence and self-identity are to be found, I would urge, in a whole beyond thought, a whole to which thought points and in which it is included, but which is known only in abstract character and could not be verified in its detail. And since I have been taken to build on assumptions which I am unable to recognize, I will here repeat what it is that I have assumed. I have assumed first that truth has to satisfy the intellect, and that what does not do this is neither true nor real. This assumption I can defend only by showing that any would-be objector assumes it also. and I start from the root idea of being or experience, which is at once positive and ultimate. Then I certainly do not go on to assume about being that it must be self-contained, simple, or what-not, but I proceed in another manner. I take up certain facts or truths, call them what you please, that I find are offered me, and I care very little what it is I take up. These facts or truths, as they are offered, I find my intellect rejects, and I go on to discover why it rejects them. It is because they contradict themselves. They offer, that is, a complex of diversities conjoined in a way which does not satisfy my intellect, a way which it feels is not its way and which it cannot repeat as its own, a way which for it results in mere collision. For, to be satisfied, my intellect must understand, and it cannot understand by taking a congeries, if I may say so, in the lump. My intellect may for certain purposes, to use an old figure, swallow mysteries unchewed, but unchewed it is unable in the end to stomach and digest them. It has not, as some opponents of Hegel would seem to assume, any such strange faculty of sensuous intuition. On the contrary, my intellect is discursive, and to understand it must go from one point to another, and in the end also must go by a movement which it feels satisfies its nature. Thus, to understand a complex AB, I must begin with A or B. And beginning, say, with A, if I then merely find B, I have either lost A or I have got beside of something else, and in neither case have I understood. For my intellect cannot simply unite a diversity, nor has it in itself any form or way of togetherness, and you gain nothing if beside A and B you offer me their conjunction in fact. For to my intellect that is no more than another external element. And facts, once for all, are for my intellect not true unless they satisfy it. And, so far as they are not true, then, as they are offered, they are not reality. From this I conclude that what is real must be self-contained and self-subsistent and not qualified from the outside. For an external qualification is a mere conjunction, and that, we have seen, is for the intellect an attempt of diversity simply to identify themselves, and such an attempt is what we mean by self-contradiction. Hence whatever is real must be qualified from itself, and that means that, so far as it is real, it must be self-contained and self-subsistent. And, since diversities exist, they must therefore somehow be true and real, and since, to be understood and to be true and real, they must be united. Hence they must be true and real in such a way that from A ox B the intellect can pass to its further qualification without an external determination of either. But this means that A and B are united, each from its own nature, in a whole which is the nature of both alike. And hence it follows that in the end there is nothing real but a whole of this kind. From the other side, why do I hold reality to be a self-contained and self-consistent individual? It is because otherwise, if I admit an external determination and a qualification by another, I am left with a conjunction, and that for the intellect is a self-contradiction. On the other hand, the real cannot be simple, because, to be understood, it must somehow be taken with and be qualified by the diversity which is a fact. The diversity therefore must fall within and be subordinate to a self-determined whole, an individual system, and any other determination is incompatible with reality. These ideas may be mistaken, but to my mind they do not seem to be obscure, nor again are they novel. But if I may judge from the way in which some critics have taken them, they must involve some great obscurity or difficulty. But, not apprehending this, I am unfortunately unable to discuss it. We have found that nothing in itself is opposite and refuses to unite. Everything again is opposite if brought together into a point which owns no internal diversity. Every bare conjunction is therefore contradictory when taken up by thought, because thought in its nature is incapable of conjunction and has no way of mere together. On the other side, no such conjunction is, or possibly could be given. It is itself a mere abstraction, useful perhaps and so legitimate and so far valid, but taken otherwise to be condemned as the main root of error. Contradiction is appearance, everywhere removable by distinction and by further supplement, and removed actually, if not in and by the mere intellect, by the whole which transcends it. On the other hand, contradiction, or rather what becomes such, as soon as it is thought out, is everywhere necessary. Facts and views partial and one-sided, incomplete and so incoherent, things that offer themselves as characters of a reality which they cannot express, and which present in them moves them to jar with and to pass beyond themselves. In a word, appearances are the stuff of which the universe is made. If we take them in their proper character, we shall be prone neither to overestimate nor to slight them. We have now seen the nature of incompatibles or contraries. There are no native contraries, and we have found no reason to entertain such an idea. Things are contrary when, being diverse, they strive to be united in one point which in itself does not admit of internal diversity. And for the intellect, any bare conjunction is an attempt of this sort. The intellect has in its nature no principle of mere togetherness, and the intellect again can accept nothing which is alien to itself. A foreign togetherness of elements is for the intellect, therefore, but one offered external element the more. And, since the intellect demands a unity, every distinguishable aspect of a together must be brought into one. And if in this unity no internal connection of diversity natural to the intellect can be found, we are left with a diversity belonging to and conjoined in one undistinguished point. And this is contradiction, and contradiction in the end we found was this and nothing but this. On the other hand, we urge that bare irrational conjunctions are not given as facts. Every perceived complex is a selection from an indefinite background, and, when judged as real, it is predicated both of this background and of the reality which transcends it. Hence in this background and beyond it lies, we may believe, the reason and the internal connection of all we take as a mere external together. Conjunction and contradiction, in short, is but our defect, our one-sidedness, and our abstraction. And it is appearance and not reality. But the reason we have to assume may in detail be not accessible to our intellect. Note B. Relation and quality. There are some aspects of the general problem of relation and quality on which I will offer some words of explanation. The subject is large and difficult, and deserves a far more thorough treatment than I am able at present to bestow on it. There is the question whether qualities can exist independent of some whole, whether they can exist independent of relations, whether, where there are fresh relations, new qualities are made and old ones altered, or whether again one can have a merely external relation, and, lastly, whether and in what sense, wherever there is an identity, we have a right to speak of a relation. Within any felt whole, and that term includes here anything which contains an undistinguished diversity, any totality of aspects which is not broken up, the diversities qualify that whole, and are felt as making it what it is. Are these diversities to be called qualities, Page 27. It is really perhaps a verbal question. Anything that is somewhat at all may be said to be or to have a quality. But on the other hand, we may prefer to use quality specially of those diversities which are developed when wholes are analyzed into terms and relations. And, when we ask if there can be qualities without relations, this distinction becomes important. The question must be answered affirmatively if we call by the name of quality the diverse aspects of feeling. But on the other hand, such diverse aspects cannot exist independently. They are not given except as contained in and as qualifying some whole, and their independence consists merely in our vicious abstraction. Nor when we pass to the relational stage does diversity cease to be the inseparable adjective of unity. For the relations themselves cannot exist except within and as the adjectives of an underlying unity. The whole that is analyzed into relations and terms can fall into the background and be obscured, but it can never be dissipated. And, if it were dissipated, then with it both terms and relations would perish. For there is no absolute between or together, nor can between and together be the mere adjectives of self-existent units. Qualities in the end can have no meaning except as contained in and as dependent on some whole, and whether that whole is relational or otherwise makes no difference in this respect. And it is not hard, perhaps, at this point to dispose of a fallacy which seems somewhat common. You may take, it is said, some terms, A, B, and C, and may place them in various relations, X, Y, and Z, and through all they remain still A, B, and C. And this, it is urged, proves that A, B, and C exist, or may exist, free from all relations, or at least independently. My character, for example, may be compared with that of another man, or, having first lived to the north of him, I may then change to the south. And to neither of us need it make a difference, and therefore we both are unaffected and so independent, but an answer to this fallacy seems even obvious. What is proved is that a certain character may, as such and in respect of that character, exist indifferently in various relations. But what is not proved at all is that this character could exist independent and naked. And since the argument starts by presupposing without any inquiry the independent existence of the character and indeed rests throughout on that presupposed existence, it could in no case arrive, it seems to me, at the desired conclusion. The most that it could show would be that some relations are external and may make no difference to their terms. But to argue from this that all the relations are or even may be external, and that some qualities either do or may exist independently, seems quite illogical. Such an argument obviously could at once be met by a distinction drawn between different kinds of relations. For myself, I neither make nor accept such a distinction except as relative and subordinate. I do not admit that any relation whatever can be merely external and make no difference to its terms, and I will now proceed to discuss this important point. I will begin by first dismissing a difficult question. Qualities exist, we have seen, improperly as diverse aspects of felt wholes, and then again properly as terms which are distinguished and related. But how far are we to say that such characters as those, e.g., of different colors, are made by distinction, and were not of the same quality at all when mere aspects of the unanalyzed? To this question I will not attempt a reply, because I am sure that I should not do it justice. I have great sympathy with the view that such characters are so developed as to be in a sense constituted by distinction, but I cannot defend this view or identify myself with it. And for myself, and for argument's sake at least, I shall admit that a quality in feeling may already have the character, A or B, which we find when afterwards quality proper is made by distinction. In no case will there be a quality existing independently, but while you keep to aspects of a felt whole, it will not be true that every quality depends on relation. And on the other hand, between such aspects and qualities proper, there may be an identity in some character A or B. From this we are led to the question, are qualities and in general are terms altered necessarily by the relations into which they enter? In other words, are there any relations which are merely extrinsical? And by this I do not mean to ask if there can be relations outside of and independent of some whole, for that question I regard as answered in the negative. I am asking whether, within the whole and subject to that, terms can enter into further relations and not be affected by them. And this question again is not, can A, B, and C become the terms of fresh relations, and still remain A, B, and C? For clearly a thing may be altered partly and yet retain a certain character, and one and the same character may persist unaltered though the terms that possess it are in some other ways changed. And this is a point on which in the present connection I shall have later to insist. Further, our question does not ask if terms are in any sense whatever qualified by their relations. For every one, I presume, admits this in some sense, however hard that sense may be to fix. The question I am putting is whether relations can qualify terms A, B, and C from the outside merely and without in any way affecting and altering them internally. And this question I am compelled to answer negatively. At first sight, obviously, such external relations seem possible and even existing. They seem given to us, we saw, in change of spatial position and again also in comparison. That you do not alter what you compare or rearrange in space seems to common sense quite obvious, and that on the other side there are as obvious difficulties does not occur to common sense at all. And I will begin by pointing out these difficulties that stand in the way of our taking any relations as quite external in a mental act, such for instance as comparison. There is a relation in the result, and this relation, we hear, is to make no difference to the terms. But, if so, to what does it make a difference, and what is the meaning and sense of qualifying the terms by it? If in short it is external to the terms, how can it possibly be true of them? To put the same thing otherwise, if we merely make the conclusion, is that conclusion a true one? But if the terms from their inner nature do not enter into the relation, then, so far as they are concerned, they seem related for no reason at all, and, so far as they are concerned, the relation seems arbitrarily made. But otherwise the terms themselves seem affected by a merely external relation. To find the truth of things by making relations about them seems indeed a very strange process, and confronted with this problem common sense, I presume, would take refuge in confused metaphors. And alterations of position in space once more give rise to difficulty. Things are spatially related, first in one way, and then become related in another way, and yet in no way themselves are altered, for the relations, it is said, are but external. But I reply that, if so, I cannot understand the leaving by the terms of one set of relations and their adoption of another fresh set, the process and its result to the terms, if they contribute nothing to it, seems really irrational throughout. But, if they contribute anything, they must surely be affected internally. And by the introduction of an outer compelling agency, the difficulty is not lessened. The connection of the terms with this agency, and the difference it seems to make to them, whereby the hypothesis no difference can be made, seem a hopeless puzzle. In short, all we reach by it is the admission that the terms and their relation do not by themselves include all the facts, and beyond that admission it is useless. And this leads to a further doubt about the sufficiency of external relations. Every sort of whole, and certainly every arrangement in space, has a qualitative aspect. In various respects the whole has a character, even its figure may here be included, which cannot be shown to consist barely in mere terms and mere relations between them. You may say that this character belongs to them, but it still is more than what they are by themselves. And if things in space by a new arrangement produce a fresh aspect of quality, of what, I would ask, are you going to predicate this quality? If the terms contribute anything whatever, then the terms are affected by their arrangement. And to predicate the new result barely of the external relations seems, to me at least, impossible. This question, as to how far by external relations fresh quality can be produced, is one which would carry us very far. I notice it here as a further difficulty which besets the thesis of mere extrinsical relation. And if in conclusion I am told that, of course, there are upon any view difficulties, I am ready to assent. But the question is whether this doctrine, offered as obvious, does not turn mere difficulties into sheer self-contradictions, and whether once more accept as a relative point of view it is not as uncalled for as it is in principle false. But the facts, it will be said, of spatial arrangement and of comparison, to mention only these, force you, whether you like it or not, to accept the view that at least some relations are outward only. Now that for working purposes we treat, and do well to treat, some relations as external merely, I do not deny, and that, of course, is not the question at issue here. That question is in short whether this distinction of internal and external is absolute or is but relative, and whether in the end and in principle a mere external relation is possible and forced on us by the facts. And except as a subordinate view I submit that the latter thesis is untenable. But the discussion of this matter involves unfortunately a wide and difficult range of questions, and my treatment of it must be brief and, I fear, otherwise imperfect. If we begin by considering the form of spatial arrangement, we seem to find at first complete real externality. All the points there are terms which may be taken indifferently in every kind of arrangement, and the relations seem indifferent and merely outward. But this statement, as soon as we reflect, must partly be modified. The terms cannot be taken truly as being that which actually they are not. And the conclusion will follow that the terms actually and in fact are related amongst themselves in every possible manner. Every space, if so, would be a whole in which the parts throughout are interrelated already in every possible position, and reciprocally so determine one another. And this, if puzzling, seems at least to follow inevitably from the premises. And from this the conclusion cannot be drawn that the terms are inwardly indifferent to their relations, for the whole internal character of the terms, it seems, goes out, on the contrary, and consists in these. And how can a being, if absolutely relative, be related merely externally? And if you object that the question is not about mere space, but rather about things in space, this is in fact the point to which I am desiring to direct your attention. Space by itself and its barely spatial relations and terms are all alike mere abstractions, useful no doubt, but, if taken as independently, real, inconsistent, and false. And in a less degree the same holds, I would now urge, also of bodies in space and of their relations therein. We have seen that a mere space of mere external relations is an inconsistent abstraction, and that, for space to exist at all, there must be an arrangement which is more than spatial. Without qualitative differences, pages 17, 38, there are no distinctions in space at all. There is neither position nor change of position, neither shape nor bodies nor motion. And just as in this sense there are no mere spatial relations without concrete terms, so in another sense also there is nothing barely spatial. The terms and the relations between them are themselves mere abstractions from a more concrete qualitative unity. Neither the things in space nor their space, nor both together, can be taken as substantial. They are abstractions depending on a more concrete whole which they fail to express. And their apparent externality is itself a sign that we have in them appearance and not ultimate reality. As to that apparent externality there can be no doubt. Why this thing is here and not there, what the connection is in the end between spatial position and the quality that holds it and is determined by it, remains unknown. In mechanical explanation generally the connection of the elements with the laws, even if the laws themselves were rational, remains unknown and external, and the reason why the results follow from the premises is admitted at a certain point to be left outside. Where this point is to be placed, whether at the beginning or merely when we arrive at secondary qualities, it is not necessary here to settle. But any such irrationality and externality cannot be the last truth about things. Somewhere there must be a reason why this and that appear together. And this reason and reality must reside in the whole from which terms and relations are abstractions, a whole in which their internal connection must lie, and out of which from the background appear those fresh results which never could have come from the premises. The merely external is, in short, our ignorance set up as reality, and to find it anywhere, except as an inconsistent aspect of fact, we have seen is impossible. But it will be objected on the part of common sense that we must keep to the facts. The billiard balls on a table may be in any position you please, and you and I and another may be changed respectively in place, and yet none of these things by these changes is altered in itself. And the apparent fact that by external change in space and time a thing may be affected is, I presume, rejected on the ground that this does not happen when you come down to the last elements of things. But an important if obvious distinction seems here overlooked. For a thing may remain unaltered if you identify it with a certain character, while taken otherwise the thing is suffering change. If, that is, you take a billiard ball and a man in abstraction from place, they will of course, so far as this is maintained, be indifferent to changes of place. But on the other hand neither of them, if regarded so, is a thing which actually exists, each is a more or less valid abstraction. But take them as existing things and take them without mutilation, and you must regard them as determined by their places and qualified by the whole material system into which they enter. And, if you demur to this, I ask you once more of what you are going to predicate the alterations and their results. The billiard ball, to repeat, if taken apart from its place and its position in the whole, is not an existence but a character, and that character can remain unchanged, though the existing thing is altered with its changed existence. Everything other than this identical character may be called relatively external. It may, or it may not, be in comparison unimportant, but absolutely external it cannot be. And if you urge that in any case the relation of the thing's character to its spatial existence is unintelligible, and that how the nature of the thing which falls outside our abstraction contributes to the whole system, and how that nature is different as it contributes differently, is in the end unknown, I shall not gainsay you. But I prefer to be left with ignorance, and with inconsistencies, and with insoluble difficulties essential to a lower and fragmentary point of view, and soluble only by the transcendence of that appearance in a fuller whole, a transcendence which in detail seems for us impossible. I prefer, I say, to be left thus rather than to embrace a worse alternative. I cannot on any terms accept as absolute fact a mere abstraction and a fixed standing inconsistency. And the case surely is made worse when one is forced to admit that, starting from this principle, one sooner or later cannot in the very least explain those results which follow in fact. I will next consider the argument for merely external relations which has been based on comparison. Things may be the same, it is said, but not related until you compare them, and their relations then fall quite outside and do not qualify them. Two men with red hair, for example, it may be urged, are either not related at all by their sameness, or when related by it are not altered, and the relation therefore is quite external. Now if I suggest that possibly all the red-haired men in a place might be ordered to be collected and destroyed, I shall be answered, I presume, that their red hair does not affect them directly, and though I think this answer unsatisfactory, I will pass on. But with regard to comparison, I will begin by asking a question. It is commonly supposed that by comparison we learn the truth about things. But now, if the relation established by comparison falls outside of the terms, in what sense, if at all, can it be said to qualify them? And of what, if not of the terms, are the truths got by comparison true? And in the end, I ask, is there any sense, and, if so, what sense in truth that is only outside and about things? Or, from the other side, if truth is truth, can it be made by us, and can what is only made by us possibly be true? These are questions which, I venture to repeat, should be met by the upholders of mere external relations. For myself, I am convinced that no such relations exist. There is no identity or likeness possible except in a whole, and every such whole must qualify and be qualified by its terms. And, where the whole is different, the terms that qualify it and contribute to it must so far be different, and so far therefore by becoming elements in a fresh unity the terms must be altered. They are altered so far only, but still they are altered. You may take by abstraction a quality A, B, or C, and that abstract quality may throughout remain unchanged. But the terms related are more than this quality, and they will be altered. And if you reply that at any rate the term and its quality are external the one to the other, I reply, yes, but not, as you say, external merely and absolutely. For nothing in the world is external so except for our ignorance. We have two things felt to be the same but not identified. We compare them, and then they are related by a point of identity. And nothing, we hear, is changed but mere extrinsical relations. But against this meaningless thesis I must insist that in each case the terms are qualified by their whole, and that in the second case there is a whole which differs both logically and psychologically from the first whole. And I urge that in contributing to this change the terms are so far altered. They are altered though in respect of an abstract quality they remain the same. Let us keep to our instance of two red-haired men, first seen with red hair but not identified in this point, and then these two men related in the judgment. They are the same in being red-haired. In each case there is a whole which is qualified by and qualifies the terms, but in each case the whole is different. The men are taken first as contained in and as qualifying a perceived whole, and their redness is given an immediate unconditional unity with their other qualities and with the rest of the undivided sensible totality. But, in the second case, this sensible whole has been broken up, and the men themselves have been analyzed. They have each been split up into a connection of red-hairedness with other qualities, while the red-hairedness itself has become a subject and a point of unity connecting the diversities of each instance, diversities which are predicated of it and connected with one another under it. And the connection of the two men's diversities with this general quality, and with one another through it, I must insist is truth and is reality, however imperfect and impure. But this logical synthesis is a unity different from the sensible whole, and in passing into this unity I cannot see how to deny that the terms have been altered. And to reply that, if you abstract and keep to the abstract point of red-hairedness, there is no change, is surely a complete ignoratio elenchi. By being red-haired the two men are related really, and their relation is not merely external. If it were so wholly, it would not be true or real at all, and, so far as it seems so, to that extent it is, but the appearance of something higher. The correlation of the other circumstances of and characters in the two men with the quality of red-hairedness cannot, in other words, possibly be bare chance. And if you could have a perfect relational knowledge of the world, you could go from the nature of red-hairedness to these other characters which qualify it, and you could from the nature of red-hairedness reconstruct all the red-haired men. In such perfect knowledge you could start internally from any one character in the universe, and you could from that pass to the rest. You would go in each case more or less directly or indirectly, and with unimportant characters the amount of indirectness would be enormous, but no passage would be external. Such knowledge is out of our reach, and it is perhaps out of the reach of any mind that has to think relationally. But if in the absolute knowledge is perfected, as we conclude it is, then in a higher form the end of such knowledge is actually realized, and with ignorance and chance the last show of externality has vanished. And if this seems to you monstrous, I ask you at least to examine for yourself, and to see whether a merely external truth is not more monstrous. But I am a red-haired man, I shall hear, and I know what I am, and I am not altered in fact when I am compared with another man, and therefore the relation falls outside. But no finite individual, I reply, can possibly know what he is, and the idea that all his reality falls within his knowledge is even ridiculous. His ignorance, on the contrary, of his own being, and of what that involves, may be called enormous. And if by what he is he means certain qualities in abstraction from the rest, then let him say so and admit that his objection has become irrelevant. If the nature and being of a finite individual were complete in itself, then of course he might know himself perfectly and not know his connection with aught else. but, as he really is, to know perfectly his own nature would be, with that nature, to pass in knowledge endlessly beyond himself. For example, a red-haired man who knew himself utterly would and must, starting from within, go on to know everyone else who has red hair, and he would not know himself until he knew them. But, as things are, he does not know how or why he himself has red hair, nor how or why a different man is also the same in that point, and therefore, because he does not know the ground, the how and why, of his relation to the other man, it remains for him relatively external, contingent, and fortuitous. But there is really no mere externality except in his ignorance. We have seen that, logically and really, all relations imply a whole to which the terms contribute and by which the terms are qualified. And I will now briefly point out that psychologically the same thing holds good. When, in the first place, I merely experience things the same in one point, or in other words, merely experience the sameness of two things, and when, in the second place, I have come to perceive the point of sameness and the relation of the two things, there is in each case in my mind a psychical whole. But the whole in each case is different, and the character of the whole must depend on the elements which it contains, and must also affect them. And an element passing into a fresh whole will be altered, though it of course may remain the same from one abstract side. But I will not dwell on a point which seems fairly clear, and which, except as an illustration, is perhaps not quite relevant. Still, it is well to note the fact that a merely external relation seems psychologically meaningless. Nothing in the whole and in the end can be external, and everything less than the universe is an abstraction from the whole, an abstraction more or less empty, and the more empty the less self-dependent relations and qualities are abstractions, and depend for their being always on a whole which they inadequately express, and which remains always less or more in the background. It is from this point of view that we should approach the question, how can new qualities be developed and emerge? It is a question, I would repeat, which, with regard to secondary qualities, has been made familiar to us. But the problem as to the limits of explanation must for metaphysics arise long before that point is reached. Into this matter I shall not enter, but I desire to lay stress on the general principle. Where results emerge in fact, which do not follow from our premises, there is nothing here to surprise us. For behind the abstractions we have used is the concrete qualitative whole on which they depend, and hence what has come out in the result has but issued from the conditions which we have endeavored to ignore and to exclude. And this should prove to us that the premises with which we worked were not true or real, but were a mutilated fragment of reality. I will deal now with a problem connected with the foregoing. I have in this book, wherever it was convenient, spoken of identity as being a relation. And I may be asked whether and how I am able to justify this. For terms are related, it will be said, for instance when I compare them, and, it seems, not before. And my past states when recalled by identity are related to my present, but apparently otherwise not so. And my state and another man's may be more or less identical, but they seem not always to connect us. On the other hand, of course, we meet with the old difficulty as to my merely making the relations which I find, and any such position appears to be untenable. Hence, on the one side, it seems, we must, and on the other side, it seems, we cannot say that all identity is a relation. The solution of the problem is, however, in a few words, this. Identity must be taken as having a development through several stages. At a certain stage, no identity is relational, while at a higher stage, all is so. And because in the absolute the highest stage is actually realized, therefore we may, where convenient, treat identity as being already a relation, when actually for us it is not one. This statement I will now proceed to explain briefly. We have seen that as a fact sameness exists at a stage below relations. It exists as an aspect both of a diversity felt in my mind and again of a diversity taken to exist beyond my feeling. Now this aspect is not the mere adjective of independent things, and any such view I consider to be refuted. The diversity itself depends on and exists only as the adjective of a whole, and within this whole the point of sameness is a unity and a universal realized in the differences which through it are the same. But so far this unity is, we may say, immediate and not relational. And the question is why and how we can call it a relation when it is not a relation actually for us. It would never do for us simply and without any explanation to fall back on the potential, for that, if unexplained, is a mere attempt at compromise between is and is not. But if the potential is used for that which actually is, and which under certain conditions is not manifest, the potential may cease to be a phrase and may become the solution of the problem. All relations, we have seen, are the inadequate expression of an underlying unity. The relational stage is an imperfect and incomplete development of the immediate totality. But, on the other hand, it really is a development. It is an advance and a necessary step towards that perfection which is above relations, supersedes and still includes them. Hence in the absolute, where all is complete, we are bound to hold that every development reaches its end, whatever that end may be, and in whatever sense we are to say the thing comes to it. The goal of every progress, therefore, may be taken as already attained in reality and as now present and actual. I do not mean that without exception all immediate sameness must pass through the relational consciousness. But without exception no sameness reaches its truth and final reality except in the whole which is beyond relations and which carries out what they attempt, and in the main the way of relations is the necessary mode of progress from that which is incomplete to its perfection. All sameness then not only may but must become relational, or at least must be realized in the same end and on the same principle as would have perfected it if it had passed through relational identity. And because in the absolute what must be is, I think that, wherever there is identity, we may speak of a relation, so long of course as we are clear about the sense in which we speak of it. And this is how and why, in thinking, I can find the relations that I make. For what I develop is in the absolute already complete. But this, on the other hand, does not mean that my part in the affair is irrelevant, that it makes no difference to truth and is external. To be made and to be found is on the contrary essential to the development and being of the thing, and truth in its processes and results belongs to the essence of reality. Only, here as everywhere, we must distinguish between what is internally necessary and what is contingent. It belongs to the essence of sameness that it should go on to be thought and to be thought in a certain way. But that it should be thought by you and not by me, by a man with brown hair or with red, does not belong to its essence. These features in a sense qualify it, for they are conjoined to it, and no conjunction can in the end be a mere conjunction and be barely external. But the connection here is so indirect and so little individual, it involves so much of other conditions lying in the general background, so much the introduction of which would by addition tend to transform and swamp this particular truth and fact as such, that such features are rightly called external and contingent, but contingency is of course always a matter of degree. This leads to the question whether and how far resemblance qualifies the real resemblance is the perception or feeling of a more or less unspecified partial identity, and, so far as the identity is concerned, we have therefore already dealt with it. But taking resemblance not as partial identity but as a mode in which identity may appear, how are we to say that it belongs to reality? Certainly it belongs and must belong, and about that there is no question. The question is, in a word, about the amount and degree of its necessity and contingency. Have I a right, wherever I find partial sameness, to speak of resemblance, in the proper sense, as I had a right under the same conditions to speak of a relation? As a matter of fact, not all identity appears under the form of resemblance, and can I conclude, somehow in the absolute it all must, and therefore does, possess this form, and may therefore everywhere be spoken of as possessing it? The answer to this question is to be found, I presume, in an inquiry into the conditions of resemblance. What is it that is added to the experience of partial sameness in order to make it into the experience of resemblance? Can this addition be looked on as a development of sameness from within, and as a necessary step to its completion, or does it on the other hand depend on conditions which are relatively external? How direct, in other words, is the connection between resemblance and identity, and, in order to get the former from the latter, what amount of other conditions would you have to bring in? And how far in the end could you say that the resemblance came from the identity rather than from these other conditions? If you can conclude, as for myself I certainly cannot, that resemblance is an essential development of sameness, then if you will also affirm the principle that in reality what must be is actual already, you will have a right for certain purposes to call the same similar, even where no similarity appears. But to do this otherwise, except of course by way of a working fiction, will surely be indefensible. Point 1. With this I must end these two imperfect remarks on relation and quality. I will take up some other points with regard to identity and resemblance in the following note. Note C. Identity. In the preceding note we were led to consider a question about identity, and I will here go on to deal with some others. It would of course be far better that such questions should arise and be answered each in its proper place, but except in a systematic treatise that is not possible. It may be that identity should be used only in a restricted sense, but in any case such a restriction would involve and have to be based on a comprehensive inquiry. And apart from a restriction, the whole question about identity would cover the entire field of metaphysics. Wherever there is a unity of the manifold, there is an identity in diversity, and a study of the principal forms of unity in difference would not leave much outside it. And hence, because I could not treat properly the different forms of identity, I did not attempt even to set them out. Certainly I saw no advantage in cataloging everyday distinctions, such as those between two men of the same sort, and two men in the same place or time, and again 2 periods of a man's one life. It did not occur to me that such distinctions could fail to be familiar or that anyone could desire to be informed of them. I presupposed as a matter of course a knowledge of them, and, if I myself anywhere confused them, I have not found the place. Point 1. And I cannot attempt any thorough investigation of their nature or of many other problems that must arise in any serious effort to deal with identity. I will, however, add here some remarks which are offered to the reader for whatever they may be worth to him. 1. The first question I will ask is whether all identity is qualitative. This is closely connected with the discussion of the preceding note, which I take here to have been read. Now the answer to our question must depend on the sense in which we use quality. Anyone can of course perceive that the sameness of a thing with itself at different times differs from its possession with another thing of one and the same character. And, as we have seen, if quality is restricted to that which is the term of a relation, then at any stage before distinction obviously you will have no quality. The unity of a felt whole, for example, which is certainly an identity, will as certainly not be qualitative, nor will there be qualitative sameness ever between what is felt and then later perceived. But, as we saw, the whole question is in part one of words, quality being a term which is ambiguous. In its lowest meaning it applies to anything that in any sense qualifies and makes anything to be somewhat. It therefore will cover everything except the universe taken as such. And of course to ask if in this sense relations generally, or again space or time or quantity, are or are not qualities, would be absurd. The question begins to have an interest, however, when we consider any attempt to set up some form of finite existence, or existence itself, as real in distinction from character in its widest sense, or an attempt, in other words, to discover a finite something which from some side of its being is not a somewhat. And since in any something the distinction of that from what is not absolute but only relative, such a pursuit is in the end illusory. All appearance in the end is but content and character which qualifies the absolute, and it is in the end the absolute alone to which the term quality cannot be applied. Here first we find a reality which is beyond a mere what. But neither here nor anywhere can we find a reality which is merely that. To make reality, these two aspects must be united inseparably, and indeed their separation is appearance itself. So that if the question is all identity qualitative means is every sameness that of qualities proper, we must answer it in the negative. But in any other sense our answer to the question must be affirmative. For we must repel the suggestion of a sameness which is not that of content and which consists in an identity of mere existence. From this I pass to a kindred question: is all identity ideal? It is so always, we must reply, in this sense that it involves the self-transcendence of that which is identical. Where there is no diversity there is no identity at all, the identity in abstraction from the diversity having lost its character. But, on the other hand, where the diversity is not of itself the same, but is only taken so or made so from the outside, once more identity has vanished. Sameness, in short, cannot be external merely, but this means that the character and being of the diverse is carried beyond and is beyond itself, and is the character of what is so beyond, and this is ideality. Thus the unity of any felt whole in this sense is ideal, and the same is true emphatically of the identity in any spatial or temporal continuum. The parts there exist only so far as they are relative, determined from the outside, and themselves on the other hand passing each beyond itself and determining the character of the whole. And within each part again the parts are in the same way ideal. Nothing in fact can be more absurd than the common attempt to find the unity and continuity of the discrete in something outside the series. For if the discretes of themselves were not continuous, certainly nothing else could make them so. But if of themselves they are continuous, their continuity is ideal, and the same thing holds mutatis mutandis of every kind of identity. 2. All identity, then, is qualitative in the sense that it all must consist in content and character. There is no sameness of mere existence, for mere existence is a vicious abstraction. And everywhere identity is ideal and consists in the transcendence of its own being by that which is identical. And in its main principle and in its essence identity is everywhere one and the same, though it differs as it appears in and between different kinds of diversities. And on account of these diversities, to deny the existence of a fundamental underlying principle appears to me to be irrational. But I would repeat that in my opinion the variety cannot be shown as internally developed from the principle, and even to attempt to set it out otherwise systematically is more than I can undertake. It may, however, perhaps assist the reader if I add some remarks on temporal and spatial, and again on numerical identity, matters where there reigns, I venture to think, a good deal of prejudice. There is a disposition on the ground of such facts as space and time to deny the existence of any one fundamental principle of identity. And this disposition is hard to combat since it usually fails to found itself upon any distinct principle. A tacit alternative may be assumed between existence and quality, and on this may rest the assertion that some sameness belongs to mere existence, and falls therefore under a wholly alien principle. But because not all identity is between qualities in one sense of that term, it does not follow that any identity can fail to be qualitative in a broader sense, and thus the whole alternative disappears. The question, in short, whether one can really have distinction without difference, or difference without diversity in character, does not seem to have been considered. Now we have just seen that space and time exemplify in their characters the one principle of identity, since all their parts are self-transcended and are only themselves by making a whole. And I will once more point out that, apart from distinctions which, I presume, we must call qualitative, space and time do not exist in mere space or mere time. There are no distinctions, nor any possibility of finding them. Without up and down, right and left, incoming and outgoing, space and time disappear, and it seems to me that these distinctions must be called qualitative. And surely again time and space are real only in limited spaces and durations. But what is it which limits and so makes a space or a time, except that it ends here and not somewhere else? And what does that mean except that its quality goes to a certain point and then ceases by becoming another quality? There is absolutely no meaning in one time unless it is the time of one somewhat, and any time that is the time of one somewhat is so present and is one time. And, if so, space and time are not alien from quality, and we have seen that their unity and identity is everywhere ideal. I may be told, doubtless, that this is irrelevant, and I cannot say that it is not so. And I will pass rapidly to another point. I think it likely that the alleged chasm between quality and space and time may rest on the supposed absolute exclusivity of the two latter. If two things are the same or different by belonging to the same or different spaces or times, these samenesses and differences, it will be said, are something quite apart and unique. They are not attributable to a what, but merely to existence. In meeting this objection, I will permit myself to repeat some of the substance of Chapter 19. Certainly the diversity of space, and again of time, has a character of its own. Certainly this character, though as we Have seen it is nothing when bare, on the other hand, is not merely the same with other characters and cannot be resolved into them. All this is true, but it hardly shows that the character of space or time is not a character, or that this character is not an instance of the one principle of identity in difference. And hence it is, I presume, the exclusiveness of space and time on which stress is to be laid. Now utterly exclusive the parts of space and time are admitted not to be. For example, they admit other characters and serve to differentiate them, and again one space or one time is taken to be the real identity of the other characters which it includes. Nor again can space and time be taken truly as barely external to the other qualities which they further qualify. They may remain so relatively, and for our knowledge, just as in a qualitative whole the connection of qualities may remain relatively external. But a merely external qualification, we have seen, is but appearance and in the end is not rational or real. The exclusiveness of a space or a time is to hold then, I presume, only against other times and spaces, and it is only as viewed in this one way that it is taken as absolute. Each part of space or time as against any other part is a repellent unit, and this its unity and internal identity is taken to lie merely in its one existence. But apparently here it is forgotten that the exclusiveness depends on the whole. It is only because it is in this series that the this is unique, and, if so, the this, as we have seen, is not merely exclusive, but has a self-transcendent character. So that, if there were really but one series of space or of time, and if in this way uniqueness were absolute, I cannot perceive how that could found an objection against identity. For inside the series, even if unique, there is a unity and identity which is ideal, and outside the series, if unique, there would be no exclusiveness in space or time, but simply in quality. And all this again is but hypothetical, since in space or time it is not true that there is really but one series, and any such idea is a superstition which I venture to think is refuted in this work. There are many series in time and space, and the unity of all these is not temporal and spatial, and from this it follows that, so far as we know, there might be counterparts, one or more, of anything existing in space or in time, and that, considered spatially or temporally, there would be between these different things absolutely no difference at all nor any possibility of distinction. They would differ, of course, and their respective series would differ, but that difference would not consist in space or time, but merely in quality. And with this I will end what I have to say here on the chimera of a difference in mere existence. And obviously, as it seems to me, the objector to identity advances nothing new when he brings forward the continuity of a thing in space or in time. The idea, I presume, is, as before, that in space or time we have a form of identity in difference which is in no sense an identity of character, but consists merely of existence, and that a thing is qualified by being placed externally in this form. But the mere external qualification by the form, and the existence of a form or of anything else which is not character, we have seen are alike indefensible, and, when the principle is refuted, it would seem useless to insist further on detail. Hence, leaving this, I will go on to consider a subsidiary mistake. For the identity in time of an existing thing, as in this work I have mentioned, you require both temporal continuity and again sameness in the thing's proper character. And mutatis mutandis, what is true here about temporal continuity is true also about spatial, and not to perceive this would be an error. Now whether a wholly unbroken continuity in time or space is requisite for the singleness of a thing, is a question I hear passed by. 8. But some unbroken duration obviously is wanted if there is to be duration at all. And the maintenance of its character by the thing seems to me also to be essential. The character of course may change, but this change must fall outside of that which we take to be the thing's essential quality. For otherwise, ipso facto, we have a breach in continuity. And, though this matter may seem self-evident, I have noticed with regard to it what strikes me as at least a want of clearness. What, let us ask, is a breach in the continuous existence of a thing? It does not lie in mere existence, for that is nothing at all, and it cannot again be spatial or temporal merely, for a breach there is impossible. A time, for instance, if really broken, would not be a broken time, but would have become two series with no temporal relation, and therefore with no breach. A breach therefore is but relative, and it involves an unbroken whole in which it takes place. For a temporal breach, that is, you must have first one continuous duration. Now this duration cannot consist, we have seen, of bare time, but is one duration because it is characterized throughout by one content, let us call it A. Then within this you must have also another content, let us call it B, only B is not to qualify the whole of A, but merely a part or rather parts of it. The residue of A, qualified not by B but by some other character which is negative of B, is that part of duration which in respect of B can constitute a breach. And the point which I would emphasize is this, that apart from qualification by one and the same character B, and again partial qualification by another character hostile to B, there is simply no sense or meaning in speaking of the duration of B, rather than that of something else, or in speaking of a temporal end to or of a breach in B's existence. The duration of a thing, unless the thing's quality is throughout identical, is really nonsense. I do not know how much of the above may to the reader seem irrelevant and useless. I am doing my best to help him to meet objections to the fundamental sameness of all identity. These objections, to repeat, seem to me to rest on the superstition that, because there are diverse identities, these cannot have one underlying character, and the superstition again that there is a foreign existence outside character and with a chasm between the two. Such crude familiar divisions of common sense are surely in philosophy mere superstitions. And I would gladly argue against something better if I knew where to find it. But, despite my fear of irrelevancy, I will add some words on numerical identity and difference. I venture to think this in one way a very difficult matter. I do not mean that it is difficult in principle, and that its difficulty tends to drive one to the sameness and difference of mere existence, or to distinction without difference, or to any other chimsera. If indeed we could assume blindly, as is often assumed, that the character of numerical sameness is at bottom temporal or spatial, there would be little to say beyond what has been said already. Numerical distinction is not distinction without difference, for that once more is senseless, but it may be called distinction that abstracts from and disregards any special difference. It may be called the residual aspect of distinctness without regard for its what and now. Whether the underlying difference is temporal, spatial, or something else, is wholly ignored so long as it distinguishes. And, wherever I can so distinguish, I can as a matter of fact count, and am possessed of units. Units proper doubtless do not exist apart from the experience of quantity, and I do not mean to say that apart from quantity no distinction is possible, or again that quantity could be developed rationally from anything more simple than itself. And I have emphasized the words as a matter of fact in order to leave these questions on one side, since they can be neglected provisionally. Numerical sameness, in the same way, is the persistence of any such bare distinction through diverse contexts, no matter what these contexts are. And of course it follows that, so long as and so far as sameness and difference are merely numerical, they are not spatial or temporal, nor again in any restricted sense are they qualitative. But then ensues a problem which to me, rightly or wrongly, seems an extremely hard one. In fact, my difficulty with regard to it has led me to avoid talking about numerical sameness. I have preferred rather to appear as one of those persons who are not aware of or who at least practically cannot apply this familiar distinction. And my difficulty is briefly this. Without difference in character there can be no distinction, and the opposite would seem to be nonsense. But then what in the end is that difference of character which is sufficient to constitute numerical distinction? I do not mean by this, what in the end is the relation of difference to distinction? But, setting that general question here on one side, I ask, in order for distinction to exist, what kind or kinds of diversity in character must be presupposed? Or again, we may put what is more or less the same question thus, what and of what sort is the minimum of diversity required for numerical difference and sameness, these being taken in the widest sense? And to this question I cannot return a satisfactory answer. It is easy, of course, to reply that all distinction is at bottom temporal, or again that all is spatial, or again perhaps that all is both. And I am very far from suggesting that such views are irrational and indefensible. As long as they do not make a vicious abstraction of space and time from quality, or attempt to set up space and time as forms of existence and not of character, there is nothing irrational in such views. But whether they are right or wrong, in either case to me they are useless, while they remain assertions which take no account of my difficulties. And the main difficulty to me is this. In feeling I find as a fact wholes of diversity in unity, and about some of these wholes I can discover nothing temporal or spatial. And this may first doubtless be wrong, but to me this is how the facts come. And I ask why it is impossible that a form or forms of non-temporal and non-spatial identity and difference should serve as the basis of, and should underlie, some distinction. It may be replied that without at least succession in time one would never get to have distinction at all. Yet if in fact this is so, and I do not contest it, I still doubt the conclusion. I am not sure that it follows, because without succession comes no distinction, that all distinction, when you have got it, must be in its character successive. The fact of non-temporal and non-spatial diversity in unity seems at least to exist. The distinctions which I can base on this diversity have, to me at least, in some cases no discoverable character of time or space. And the question is whether the temporal form, which we will take as necessary for distinction in its origin, must essentially qualify it. Is it not possible that, however first got, the form of distinction may become at least in some cases able to exist through and be based on a simpler and non-temporal scheme of diversity in unity? This strikes me as a difficult issue, and I do not pretend here to decide it, and I think it calls for a more careful inquiry than many persons seem inclined to bestow on it. And this is all that I think it well to say on numerical identity. But on the main question, to return to that, I do not end in doubt. There are various forms of identity in diversity, not logically derivable from one another, and yet all instances and developments of one underlying principle. The idea that mere existence could be anything, or could make anything the same or different, seems a sheer superstition. All is not quality in the special sense of quality, but all is quality in the sense of content and character. The search for that other than a what is the pursuit of a phantasm which recedes the more you approach it. But even this phantasm is the illusory show of a truth. For in the absolute there is no what divorced from and reseeking its that, but both these aspects are inseparable. 3. I think it right to add here some remarks on resemblance, though on this point I have little or nothing new to say. Resemblance or similarity or likeness, in the strict sense of the term, I take to be the perception of the more or less unspecified identity, sameness, of two distinct things. It differs from identity in its lowest form, the identity, that is, where things are taken as the same without specific awareness of the point of sameness and distinction of that from the diversity. Because it implies the distinct consciousness that the two things are two and different. It differs again from identity in a more explicit form, because it is of the essence of resemblance that the point or points of sameness should remain at least partly undistinguished and unspecified. And further, there is a special feeling which belongs to and helps to constitute the experience of similarity, a feeling which does not belong to the experience of sameness proper. On the other hand, resemblance is based always on partial sameness, and without this partial sameness, which in its own undistinguishing way it perceives, there is no experience of resemblance, and without this to speak of resemblance is meaningless. And it is because of this partial identity, which is the condition of our experiencing resemblance and which resemblance asserts, that we are able within certain limits to use same for like, and to use like for same. But the specific feeling of resemblance is not itself the partial identity which it involves, and partial identity need not imply likeness proper at all one but without partial identity, both as its condition and as its assertion. Similarity is nothing. From a logical point of view, therefore, resemblance is secondary, but this does not mean that its specific experience can be resolved into identity or explained by it. And it does not mean that, when by analysis you specify the point of sameness in a resemblance, the resemblance must vanish. Things are not made so simply as this. So far as you have analyzed, so far the resemblance is gone, and is succeeded so far by a perception of identity, but only so far. By the side of this new perception, and so far as that does not extend, the same experience of resemblance may still remain. And from this to argue that resemblance is not based on sameness is to my mind the strangest want of understanding. And again, it is indifferent whether the experience of identity or that of resemblance is prior in time and psychologically. I am myself clear that identity in its lowest sense comes first, but the whole question is for our present purpose irrelevant. The question here is whether resemblance is or is not from a logical point of view secondary, whether it is not always based on identity, while identity need not in any sense be based on it. I will now proceed to consider some objections that seem raised against this view, and will then go on to ask, supposing we deny it, in what position we are left the first part of. This task I shall treat very briefly for two reasons. Some of the objections I must regard as disposed of, and others remain to me obscure. The metaphysical objection against the possibility of any identity and quality may, I think, be left to itself, and I will pass to two others which seem to rest on misunderstanding. We are told, you cannot say that two things, which are like, are the same, unless in each you are prepared to produce and to exhibit the point of sameness. I have answered this objection already, and will merely here repeat the main point. I want to know whether it is denied that, before analysis takes place, there can be any diverse aspects of things, and whether it is asserted that analysis always makes what it brings out, or whether again one must so believe in the power of analysis as to hold that what it cannot bring out naked is therefore nothing at all, or whether again, for some unstated reason, one is to accept this not as a general principle, but only where sameness is concerned. When I know what I have to meet, I will endeavor to meet it, but otherwise I am helpless. Point 2 and another objection, which I will now notice, remains also unexplained. The perception of a series of degrees, it seems to be contended, is a fact which proves that there may be resemblance without a basis of identity. I have tried to meet this argument in various forms, 3 so far as I have been able to understand them, and I will add here that I have pressed in vain for any explanation on the cardinal point. Can you, I would repeat, have a series of degrees which are degrees of nothing, and otherwise have you not admitted an underlying identity? And if I am asked, cannot there be degrees in resemblance? I answer that of course there can be. But, if so, and in this case, the resemblance itself is the point of identity of and in which there are degrees, and how that is to show either that there is no identity at all, or again that no identity underlies the resemblance, I cannot conjecture. I admit, or rather I urge and insist, that the perception of a series is a point as difficult as in psychology it is both important and too often neglected. But on the other side I insist that by denying identity you preclude all possibility of explaining this fact, and have begun by turning the fact into inexplicable nonsense. And no one, I would add, can fairly be expected to answer an objection the meaning of which is not stated. Passing from this point, let us ask what is the alternative to identity. If we deny sameness in character and assert mere resemblance, with what are we left? We are left, it seems to me, in confusion, and end with sheer nonsense. How mere resemblance without identity is to qualify the terms that resemble is a problem which is not faced, and yet unsolved it threatens ruin. The use of this mere resemblance leads us in psychology to entertain gross and useless fictions, and in logic it entails immediate and irretrievable bankruptcy. If the same in character does not mean the same, our inferences are destroyed and cut in sunder, and in brief the world of our knowledge is dissolved. And how is this bankruptcy veiled? How is it that those who deny sameness in character can in logic, and wherever they find it convenient, speak of terms as the same, and mention their identity and talk of one note and one color? The expedient used is the idea or the phrase of exact likeness or for precise similarity. When resemblance is carried to such a point that perceptible difference ceases, then, I understand, you have not really got sameness or identity, but you can speak as if you had got it. And in this way the collision with language and logic is avoided or rather hidden. What in principle is the objection to this use of exact likeness? The objection is that resemblance, if in so far as you make it exact by removing all internal difference, has so far ceased to be mere resemblance, and has become identity. Resemblance, we saw, demands two things that resemble, and it demands also that the exact point of resemblance shall not be distinguished. This is essential to resemblance as contradistinguished against identity, and this is why, because you do not know what the point of resemblance is and whether it may not be complex, you cannot in logic use mere resemblance as sameness. You can indeed, we also saw, while analyzing still retain your perception of resemblance, but, so far as you analyze, you so far have got something else, and, when you argue, it is not the resemblance which you use, but the point of resemblance, if at least your argument is logical. But a point of resemblance is clearly an identity. And it is, we saw, the double sense of the word likeness, which seems to authorize this use of likeness for sameness. Likeness may mean my specific experience of resemblance, and that of course itself is not identity, or it may mean the real partial sameness in character of two things whether to me they resemble or not. Thus, exact likeness can be used for the identical character which makes the point of likeness, and it need not mean the mere likeness which can be opposed to identity. And where exact likeness does not mean the identical character, bankruptcy at once is patent. We are warned, you must not say that two notes are the same note, or that two peas have the same color, for that is to prove yourself incompetent to draw an elementary distinction, or rather you may say this with us, if with us you are clear that you do not mean it, but mean with us mere resemblance. And when we ask, are the notes and colors then really different? We hear that the likeness is exact. But with this I myself am not able to be satisfied. I want to know whether within the character of the sounds and within the character of the colors there is asserted any difference or none. And here, as I understand it, the ways divide. If you mean to deny identity, your one consistent course is surely to reply, of course there is a difference. I know what words mean, and when I said that it was not the same but only alike, I meant to assert an internal diversity, though I do not know exactly what that is. Plainly for me to have said in one breath, the character has no difference and yet it is not the same character, would have been suicidal. And this position, I admit, is so far self-consistent, but it ends on all sides in intellectual ruin. But the other way, so far as I understand it, is to admit and to assert that in exact likeness there is really no difference, to admit and to assert that it involves a point of resemblance in which internally no diversity is taken to exist, and which we use logically on the understanding that divergence of character is excluded, and then, on the other side, to insist that here we still have no sameness but only likeness. And with this, so far as I can see, there is an end of argument. I can myself understand such an attitude only as the result of an unconscious determination to deny a doctrine from fear of its consequences. But if we are to look at consequences, and I am ready to look at them, why should we be blind on one side? To avoid confusion between what may be called individual sameness and mere identity of character, we should of course all agree, is most desirable. But the idea that you will avoid a mistake by making an error, that you will prevent a confusion between different kinds of identity by altogether denying one kind, seems to me to be irrational. The identity that you deny will in practice come back always. It may return in a form genuine but disguised, obscured, and distorted by the deceptive title of exact likeness. But on the other hand it may steal in as an elusive and disastrous error. And we need not seek far to find an instructive illustration of this. J.S. Mill may be called, I presume, the leader of those who amongst us deny identity of quality, and J. S. Mill, on the other hand, taught association by similarity. At least we must say this until it has been proved here, as elsewhere with regard to the argument from particulars, that we who criticize Mill know no more of his real meaning than in fact Mill himself did. And association by similarity, as taught by Mill and his school, entails and really asserts the coarsest mythology of individual resurrection. And I do not think that the history of philosophy can exhibit a grosser case of this very confusion against which we who believe in identity are so specially warned. Yes, you may try to drive out nature, and nature will always come back, but it will not always come back as nature. And you may strive to banish identity of character, and identity always will return, and it will not always return in a tolerable form. The cardinal importance of the subject must be my excuse for the great length of this note, and for my once more taking up a controversy which gives me no pleasure, but which I feel I have no right to decline.